On a serene evening, as the soft glow of the setting sun bathed the streets, Kamiho found himself driving home after a grueling day of work in the city of Washington. His black sedan glided through the quiet, dimly lit roads, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the space. With his calm, composed demeanor and a face that bore the weight of the day, his mind wandered to the warm dinner that awaited him at home. He could already imagine the scent of a hearty meal drifting from the kitchen, a simple comfort that promised to ease the stress of his long work hours. However, as if by fate, the tranquil atmosphere was abruptly shattered when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The sudden intrusion of their vibrant glow pierced through the stillness of the night, demanding his attention. Before he could process what had just occurred, Kamiho instinctively eased his foot off the accelerator, his heart racing slightly as he slowed down and pulled the vehicle to the side of the road. He glanced in his mirrors, trying to make sense of the situation. His pulse quickened with confusion, but he remained focused, his eyes scanning the surroundings to understand why he had been stopped. The car came to a complete stop, the soft thud of the tires against the asphalt marking the end of his brief journey. A police officer approached the driver's side, the beam of a flashlight cutting through the dark night, landing squarely on Kamiho's face. The light was blinding, causing him to squint as he lowered his head, trying to shield his eyes from the piercing brightness. The officer, tall and imposing, loomed near the window. His voice, sharp and skeptical, broke the silence. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Kamiho's response came calmly, without hesitation. "Sir, I wasn't speeding. I just passed through a normal stretch of road," he explained, his voice steady despite the growing tension. However, the officer didn't seem satisfied by his answer. The officer's eyes were scanning the interior of the car, examining every detail, from the dashboard to the small compartments in the door. His gaze moved methodically, a look of suspicion etched into his face. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer demanded, his tone growing more authoritative. Kamiho raised an eyebrow, a faint furrow of confusion appearing on his brow. He didn't argue, though. He knew that questioning an officer's authority on the side of the road might only escalate the situation. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, raising his hands slightly in a gesture that conveyed compliance. His movements were deliberate, each step taken with the intention of avoiding further confrontation. In that moment, Kamiho's mind raced. What had he done wrong? Why was he being singled out like this? There was no logical explanation for it, yet the officer's firm grip on his arm made it clear that there was no room for protest. Without a word, the officer began pulling him toward the patrol car, a forceful motion that made Kamiho feel like a mere pawn in some game of power. "Is this really necessary?" Kamiho asked, his voice a mixture of bewilderment and frustration. His eyes searched the officer's face for any sign of understanding, but instead, he was met with cold silence. "I told you what to do, now you'll do as I say." The officer snapped back, his voice hard, devoid of any empathy. Kamiho felt a wave of frustration and anger welling up inside him, but he kept his emotions in check. It was clear now that his compliance wasn't about following the law. It was about submitting to the officer's authority, a test of power that had nothing to do with justice. The situation felt surreal, as if the world had shifted into a cruel and twisted parody of reality. Kamiho was shoved into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his mind. He felt as though the whole encounter was some sort of malicious game, designed not to uphold the law, but to degrade and humiliate him. His thoughts churned, but he maintained an outward calm. He knew that losing control now would only worsen things, so he held on to his composure, determined not to let the injustice of the moment take away his dignity. As the patrol car sped away from the quiet street, Kamiho stared out of the small window, watching the city lights blur past. His mind was detached from the world outside. He knew that the reason for his stop didn't matter to them. They didn't care whether he had broken any laws. To them, he was just another figure to target, another victim in their game of control. His chest tightened, a wave of frustration rising within him, but he remained quiet, steeling himself against the overwhelming sense of helplessness that threatened to consume him. Time seemed to drag on, every second stretching out as if in slow motion, until they reached the police station. Once inside, he was placed in a cold, sterile holding cell, the walls offering no comfort. The clatter of officers' boots on the concrete floor echoed down the hallway, but Kamiho remained unfazed. Outside the cell, he could hear hushed voices of officers gossiping about him, but their words had no power over him. They were simply noise, empty words that couldn't break his resolve. Hours passed, heavy and suffocating. The isolation in the holding cell was both physical and mental. His thoughts began to wander, but he refused to succumb to the darkness of doubt. It wasn't until Lieutenant Morgan, a woman of higher rank, entered the room that Kamiho's situation began to change. She was calm, authoritative, and perceptive. She immediately recognized the flaws in the officer's reports and demanded a thorough review of the case. Her eyes scanned the footage from Kamiho's dashcam, her fingers swiftly flipping through the data as she processed the details. It became clear to her that the officer's actions were unjustified, and she didn't hesitate to take action. Morgan issued the order for Kamiho's release, and her voice was firm as she promised to handle the matter with the seriousness it deserved. Before he left, she turned to him with a curious expression, her gaze softening for just a moment. "Who are you really?" she asked. The question hung in the air, as though she was trying to understand the man standing before her. Kamiho smiled slightly, his response calm yet resolute. "I'm just an ordinary man, but I will not let this injustice go by easily." As he left the police station, the weight of the entire experience settled on his shoulders, but he wasn't ready to go home just yet. He made his way to his office instead. This wasn't the end. In fact, it felt like the beginning of something far more important. A battle not against the officers who had wronged him, but against the very system he was part of, a system that needed to be held accountable. Justice wasn't just about words, it was about action, and Kamiho was ready to fight for it, whatever it took.